Hello, this is Grant Swartzwelder with another episode of Oilfield Strong. I really appreciate you being part of this, and we appreciate OTA Environmental Solutions and ESG Dynamics for helping to sponsor this episode. We are so fortunate to have Michael Liebreich as the speaker today and our guest. Michael and I have gone way, way back. Actually, went to business school together. He is, besides being a champion skier, a speaker at a variety of events and testimony in front of many legislative action groups. He is currently chairman and CEO of Liebreich Associates, where he is providing advisory services and speaking engagements for a whole host of green and various environmental, climate type finance activities. The interesting thing there is I was talking to a higher level environmental person in DC and told him that I had Michael coming on, and he was like, "How did you get Michael on?" Which was kind of a positive and a negative. One, that Michael is within the environmental world so well thought of that it was an honor to have him here. And then second, I think he was saying, how were you, Grant, able to actually have access to Michael? And so nothing like having a positive and a negative there. But with Michael also created New Energy Finance, sold that to Bloomberg in the 2014, served as president of that for many years after, and again is now with his own firm doing advisory type work. Recently, he put on his podcast, Cleaning Up, which I want everyone to really take note of that podcast. It's fantastic. It's done weekly. Please look at it. Fantastic speakers, fantastic content. But most recently, he did a presentation on pragmatic climate reset. And that was based on an article that he wrote talking about what is happening worldwide from a transition standpoint. How the U.S. is basically saying there is no transition, we're staying with fossil fuels. That's a general statement, but how that compares to the world as a whole. And so, Michael, I'd welcome you on and would really like to understand what that article's theme was and how that is going to kind of might shape how U.S. is U.S. energy policy, but also how the world is looking at it, and it looks like differently.
Grant, thank you so much for having me on the show. I didn't realize I was in such high demand, but I'll take that as a win. But it's a great pleasure to be, in fact, back on the show because we have spoken before. It was a couple of years ago and very different
Yeah.
times. So the thesis of the pragmatic climate reset is, look, we all know we're not 2 years ago, right? The world has changed. You've now got a different president. You've got different policies, very, very different approach. And the zeitgeist, the kind of the spirit, particularly in the US, but it's resonating around the world, is look, there is no transition. There doesn't really need to be a transition, and it was never happening. And to be honest, it was kind of a bit of a dream anyway. And so, yeah, there might be some damage from climate change, but it'll be trivial compared to the enormous wealth that could be generated from fossil fuels. Right now, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm actually paraphrasing pretty much, your Secretary of Energy's remarks at
You are.
CERAWeek back in earlier this year, where that was kind of the gist of what he said. So my thesis in the pragmatic climate reset was that is an incomplete or an incorrect characterization of what's happening. So frankly, the whole idea of net zero 2050, which so many companies, so many nations, the US included, but Europe and many others, Japan, signed up for, was never realistic. So if you measure the transition against, are we on track to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, then it's pretty clear that we are failing. But if you never thought that was realistic, which is certainly the camp that I'm in, it was never realistic. We've actually seen enormous progress, not as fast as all the kind of Greta Thunberg and the activists would want, but in fact, we have seen enormous progress towards decarbonizing the economy. And I really take issue with one statistic that's always trotted out, and it was trotted out actually in a piece by the legendary Dan Yergin, who's been on Cleaning Up and is somebody that I know well. Um, the statistic is, well, fossil fuels still provide 80% of global energy. And of course, they do, but of energy supply, not energy demand. And fossil fuels are so differentially inefficient that actually the real number, the proportion of human activity of the economy that is already fueled by nuclear, renewables, including hydro, bioenergy, so biomass, biofuels, biogas, and also waste heat and ambient heat through heat pumps. You add all of that together, and actually, one third of the global economy is already clean, not one fifth, one third. So we are a lot further on. The clean energy continues to grow. And the narrative of net zero 2050, 1.5 degrees was never realistic. So the reset is, walk away from it, get serious, get sensible, stop talking extremes, but just, look at what's really happening around the world.
Let's talk about that
That
supply.
brings me to the kind of global picture of, look, if you think that the transition is over because all you listen to is what's happening in the US, lift your eyes, look at what's happening, not just in China and not just in Europe, but really around the world, which is actually an acceleration of the shift to clean energy.
Back on that point, though, about supply and demand, you gave an example offline about how much waste is associated with fossil fuel energy in actually creating power, and how more efficient clean energy is. And I found that startling that it was such a big difference.
So the engineers, and I'm sure there are many that listen to your great show, will know the word exergy, which is the ability to do work. And so what you've got is that if you look at wind, solar, and hydro, what they produce is pure exergy. It's electricity straight off the bat. So when you compare that to coal, where only one third, maybe 36% actually becomes electricity, but that's already after you've extracted the coal. That doesn't include digging it and shipping it around the world and so on. So what you've got is this kind of differential inefficiency. And the example I gave you offline was before we started this conversation was, if you look at how much energy, if you have a petrol car and you have to extract oil, you lose something like 15% of the energy getting it out of the ground, dealing with the water, the produced water, refining it, shipping it around the world, and then you put it in the car and 80% of the energy content is wasted. Whereas if you start with wind, solar, hydro, then you don't have that, right? Even nuclear, in fact, you don't have all of the kind of upstream losses, even though you do have thermal losses. But with wind, solar, and hydro, essentially 85, 90% of the energy, of the primary energy, actually goes into moving you around. And so that's really a problem with the statistics. As soon as you hear anybody say primary energy, you know that they're inflating the role of all thermal technologies, coal, gas, oil, and nuclear. It inflates them. It makes them look bigger than they really are. And you start then adding into that mix things like, heat pumps, where 1 unit of energy, 1 unit of input energy turns into 3, 4 units of heat.
Right.
And so you have all these reasons why clean energy ends up, even though it looks like only 1/5 of the global energy demand, it's actually 1/3. And so we are moving faster than a lot of the commentators coming out of the oil and gas sector would like us believe.
Yeah, I wanted to go back because I thought that was such a critical point to bring up because of you always do hear about the kind of the end comparison, and there's a lot in between that goes to that. So jumping back to where you were about China and kind of how they're approaching it, and you could say that about Europe as well, but or maybe we should just say non-American countries and how they're handling uh, the transition. Contrast that to the U.S. or given your points about how China and some of those are handling it.
So there's every country, or lots of countries, there's a lot of diversity in what's happening, ex-US. In a way, by the way, the same is happening within the US. The Northeast is experiencing energy in a very different way than Texas because of just what natural resources they have and connectivity and weather patterns and so on. So, I mean, yeah, look, China is the big beast, but let me just link that point about the kind of pure energy or exergy and how much primary energy is used in a country like Pakistan, right? So Pakistan is buying an enormous amount of Chinese solar panels, batteries, and cheap cars, and it's able to use its own sunlight to power all of to power its economy. And when I say a lot, I mean between 2023 and today, they almost doubled the size of their grid using Chinese solar. It's absolutely astonishing. And, that Chinese solar, if you put that power or that, Chinese solar panel, but obviously local domestic Pakistan solar, if you put that into a car, you would need to buy 4 times as much oil from the US or from Saudi or wherever to drive the same distance, just in energy terms. And that's because of this thing called the primary energy fallacy. One unit of input energy is not the same as another. When you go from solar power into a battery or into a car, into an EV, there's so much less loss that you just can't compare it to putting the same amount of energy into a petrol car or into a diesel car. So what you've got is, yes, China going all in on electrification. And by the way, it's not because they love the climate more, or I mean, they do have a lot of scientists in government who do understand the science. So that is a part of it. But to be honest, they don't have the oil, they don't have the gas. And if they didn't, domestically, they can use coal, which is, of course, truly filthy, or they can switch to wind, solar, a bunch of other things, sort of biogas, etc., and critically, of course, also nuclear. And that's what they're doing.
Right.
But, when you look at the proportion of the economy that is driven by electricity, they've gone from way behind Europe and the US to 50% further advanced. They have overtaken in their use of electricity. And this is incredibly threatening to the interests of the US, right? Because if you look at what's happening with Pakistan, it's not just Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of Africa, what are they buying? They're buying Chinese wind turbines, they're buying Chinese solar panels, they're buying Chinese batteries, they're buying Chinese cheap cars and buses and trucks. And I don't know if you've sort of spotted the queues forming around the world for those wonderful US automobiles recently. But I'm not seeing them. There's a little bit of demand for Teslas, and that's pretty much it. So
What
this
you're
is
describing
incredibly threatening.
is national security on China's part, not from an economic side, because they're selling raw minerals and those products that you described, but also they're maintaining their own energy sources, so they're not relying on a third party that could be cut off in a time of issue. So it has
Right. And
ramifications.
they're also doing sort of, transactions. So you give us the rare earths to process in China, and we will make sure that you have access to lots of cheap energy resources, batteries, vehicles, permanent magnets, whatever. And, they have played, I hate to say it. And by the way, let me be absolutely clear for for the audience.
I think I know
This
where you're
is
heading,
not
and
a
it's true.
regime
Yeah.
this is not a regime I love or approve of remotely. It's the opposite. Okay. I am, I'm a lifelong, I don't know, small d Democrat. I mean, I love the West and democracy, and I hate this authoritarian regime and all others like it. But I will say, in terms of getting a hammerlock on the technologies of the future, they have played an absolute blinder.
No, I think what they've done on the rare earth side, you saw it when there was tariff fight between the US and China. We had to back because of that. But you look at statistics for China, back to your point, 2024, they added 373 gigawatts of renewable. They've added 34 gigawatts of nuclear over the past decade and have 23 more under construction, adding huge amount of transmission and grid for the electricity. So that's becoming very that push for electricity continues to be very, very strong. So that backs up your point of how they're being very, very proactive on the electrical side.
Absolutely. And, what you didn't mention is they also approved last year 94 gigawatts of new coal-fired power stations. And that's a scary number. Typically they've
Huge.
added, there were some years where they added 60, 70 gigawatts. And, this is a lot, just for those who are not familiar with the kind of, with the terminology or with the scale. The entire UK, I think our average demand is about 44 gigawatts. So, and I don't know which state in the US would be comparable to something like 94 gigawatts of added coal-fired power. The issue there is they're not going to use 94 gigawatts flat out of coal. What that will be used for is reliable, because it's their own coal, so it's
Right.
resilient, backup. And what you had is Russia invaded Ukraine, the gas price went crazy. China was increasing, becoming one of the major markets for LNG, and suddenly the LNG prices go crazy. What they've done is returned to more coal for a few years. And in fact, even in the last 15 months, Chinese coal demand is going down, not up. So what's actually going to happen is, first of all, those 94 gigawatts of starts, they will not all finish in 1 year. They will work their way through the system. Some, I'd be willing to bet, will never get finished, because that happens too. And they will also retire because the capacity factors will drop. Gas prices come down, lots more wind, lots more solar. And so the capacity factor of coal, the number of hours it runs every year, goes down, and the older, less efficient plants become loss making, and they then get shut. And I think that's what we're going to see. And, barring some other weird spike in gas prices, I'd be pretty confident. I have to be careful, but reasonably confident that China has actually peaked its coal demand. That it peaked in about 2014, did a little bump because of the gas prices in 2022, 2023, 2024. It's turned around, and I think it's now going to be on a long goodbye.
Long goodbye, but it serves as a good backup in case of a time of international strife to
Sure,
quickly provide energy that they control internally.
sure. And there's another piece of my pragmatic climate reset, which was, unsayable, unthinkable 2 years ago, which is, instead of going for 100% clean everything, how about we go for like 90%? And if you think about Europe, Europe is very ideological, pushing for 100%. In the UK, the major government energy policy is called CP 2030, Clean Power 2030, not 90% clean power. And in fact, they are slightly pragmatic. They've already kind of admitted it's 95. But the interesting thing is the cost of decarbonizing is actually not that high. It's really not that hard. You've got things like electric vehicles, total cost of ownership about the same as oil, as petrol and diesel. You can do a huge amount of cheap wind, cheap solar, cheap batteries now, which of course, if you look at Texas, enormous growth in the use of grid connected batteries.
Sure.
But the last 5 or 10% starts to get really, really expensive. It starts to, I don't want to say asymptote to infinity, but it gets really expensive.
Sure.
And so the pragmatic thing to do is to say, do you know what? Why don't we just do the 90% that's pretty cheap, pretty affordable, and we'll just leave the last bit. And, in China, that last bit is probably going to end up being a whole bunch of coal. In Europe, it'll be a whole bunch of gas. In the US, it will most certainly be a whole bunch of gas, no question. But I think that's the pragmatic approach that kind of squares the circle between, we're not going to boot out, we're not going to demonize fossil fuel providers, but equally, we're not going to do, I hate to say it, but the current zeitgeist, this pushback, this vindictive attack on clean energy in the US. I mean, that's not the answer either.
Yeah, unfortunately, not to get into politics too much, but it does seem like in America we tend to go all one way or all the other way. It's 100% or zero, and
And
we've done that pro EV electrical, and now it's going the other direction.
And I think if you again, I'm not. This is not. I'm not making a. I'm not. This is not a party political broadcaster, and
No.
it's just stating what I see as an international, as an outside observer. It was clear that under uh, the Biden administration, it was really an attempt to kind of meet China where it is, right? So if China's making all the solar and China's making all of the batteries and China's got the rare earths through the Inflation Reduction Act and other programs, the Loans Program Office, etc., it was an attempt to say, no, 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 we've got to compete. And now it's a 180-degree reversal, because now it's like, no, we're not going to compete in clean energy. We're going to go the opposite direction, and we're going to compete through the power of our fossil fuel industry and knowledge and power base. And look, the party political bit is whether you think that that's the right thing to do or not the right thing to do. But it is a 180-degree reversal from the strategy of trying to compete with China. It's almost handing China the keys, if I'm honest. It's saying, look, there are all these, I believe they're the industries of the future, have spent 20 years analyzing them, and essentially saying, we're just not going to play. We're not going to do that.
Well, it's definitely a big bet because if you don't have the rare earth, if you don't have cheaper EVs like China, if you don't have cheaper battery and solar like China, it's a kind of an all or nothing bet because by the time, if we do finally, or if we do realize, oh, we need to be on that transition, we're going to be so far behind cost wise, development wise, that it makes it pretty challenging.
Yeah, and I guess if I could characterize the bet a slightly different way, in a way, the US's bet is that a country like Pakistan or one of these global South countries, which by the way is where all the energy growth is coming from, that they're going to need a lot of LNG, right? And then they may
That's the talk right
buy a
now.
little bit of solar and batteries. Whereas China's bet is exactly the other way around. It's no, they're going to use a lot of solar and batteries in the form of electric cars and grid connected, etc. And you know what? If they need to buy a little bit of LNG to keep the lights on when there's no wind and no sun, then that's fine. That'll be America's business. But the main chunk, now, will it be a lot of LNG and a little bit of clean for these countries in the global south? Or will it be a lot of clean and a little bit of LNG? And I'm looking at the trends. I'm looking at they're voting with their wallets. They're voting with their with their relationships. And I can tell you they're going they're going China at this point.
So let's go back to China and see if there's any lessons that America might could pick up from how China's done it, how from a government, from a industrial standpoint, that maybe we should at least pay attention to. One thing that steps up uh, really quickly is the regulatory side. It seems like their speed, the way they handle the regulations. Now, it helps if you're in China and you have an authoritarian government, you can kind of make things happen. But it seems like the regulatory side consistently holds back the U.S. from pipelines to manufacturing to a variety of things. Thoughts on
Yeah.
that? Thoughts on other things that we could maybe learn from China?
So let me be clear. The way to beat China is not to become an authoritarian,
Yes,
country.
thank you for making
That's
that point.
definitely, like I said, I've been very clear about that. Those people who say, "Oh, isn't it great if you're a dictatorship, you can do these things really fast?" It's like, yeah, so what? That's not, you give up
You
other
bet.
things if you want to
Well,
go that
it
route. And
does
I
make certain
definitely
things easier. That doesn't mean
But
you have to
it
do
does
that.
make decisions easier. It also, by the way, it also makes vast misallocation of resources easier,
Good
right?
point. Great point.
We've seen what central planning does. We've seen it with the Soviet Union, and there's enormous misallocation of resources also in China right now. Overinvestment in infrastructure, overinvestment in real estate, overinvestment
The real
in,
estate bust
in
they have
coal-fired
is
power
largely
stations.
because of that. The real estate
The,
bust is largely because of that. Just
right. And so that's not what we should learn. I do think that large in permitting large infrastructure projects, we go too far in the direction of the whole kind of process is too drawn out. By all means, consult broadly and do all of that. But we've got to start making decisions in 6 months and 9 months, and not in 5 years and 7 years. That is just that's just crazy. Um, Having said that, what I would say, there is, even before you get to that point, if you look at what's happened, I mean, we were recording this a couple of days after the administration pulled the permits for Revolution Wind, this Ørsted offshore wind farm, it's 80% complete. I mean, you know, there's one thing to say it should have got through the permitting process more quickly, but it's another thing to say that we're going to basically, I'm sorry, arbitrarily pull the
Pull the plug.
permits that have already been given. And that has implications. If you think it has implications only for projects you don't like, if you don't like offshore wind, then maybe it's ha ha ha, that they got their comeuppance. But you know what? Next time it could be a administration of a different stripe, and it could be a different project. It could be a pipeline. It could be an airport. It could be whatever you want. And so I do think one of China's secret weapons is consistency of policy. It's not just speed, but it is also consistency, consistent availability of funding, consistency of strategy. If they are going all in on electrification, then you know that that's not a 4-year thing or an 8-year thing or a 2-year thing until the midterms, that is probably going to be a 20 to 40-year thing. And that enables you to put capital to work, and it enables people to make career decisions and all sorts. So I do think that that's a very, very key difference.
When you talk about consistency and then you talk about 5, 30 years, to me, that's an energy plan and being a consistent plan from your position over in London, doing all the international work you do. How many countries really have a true energy plan for 5 years or 20 years? And what's your sense on that?
It's a great question, because the answer is lots of countries have them, and most of them are worthless. Because you also have, don't forget, the EU, which has got its and I think you and I spoke last time quite a bit about hydrogen. The
Right.
EU has got the endless energy plans, but they are in some cases really benighted, really daft. And the UK, by the way, I hate to say it, because I know and like many of the characters involved, but the Clean Power 2030 is frankly a really foolish misallocation of resources on clean electricity, largely in the absence of a plan around clean transportation, clean heating, and clean industry. So, and then there's other bits added on in the UK about hydrogen and carbon capture and storage and so on. So I think where I come out, you want to have a direction of travel. You want to say, this is what our economy needs to look like, and this is what our energy provision, broadly speaking, will look like. So, for instance, in the US right now, have a plan for AI and data centers. Don't just be in reactive mode, permitting absolutely everything without thinking through what's a kind of end game and end status of how you'll power those things. But the idea of doing 5-year plans and having bureaucrats picking winners, picking technologies, saying, I'm sorry, we can't allow any fracking because that's not in the 2005 strategic plan for the United States energy system. You'll have to wait and see if it makes it in 2010. That would have been an absolutely colossal mistake, no
Right.
question.
Well, and kind of back to the big pendulum swings that we talked about a second ago, that kind of has an effect on the plan. And you're seeing it now. There was this big pro EV environmental plan. Now it's swung the other way. And so even if you have a plan and you can most likely change it every 4 years significantly, do you really have a plan? So how do you have a plan when you have two different parties with two very different views swinging back and forth?
Yeah, this is very reminiscent of some of the economic woes that we had in the UK during the 1970s, just before the Thatcher era, where it was almost like there was a pendulum between the two major parties getting in and out of government, and every time it kind of cancelled everything that the other one had done, partly because the UK was running out of money. Um, I don't know how to resolve it. I mean, if you're asking me how do we get out of that sort of behavior set, I don't know. But what I would say, I mean, there is another, maybe let me open up another topic in terms of the what's happening now in the US, which I'm keeping an eye on, and I think is really, really could change the political weather on this stuff, which is energy price inflation. Because a lot of what I'm seeing now is going to drive inflation. Now, I wasn't, by the way, the Inflation Reduction Act, I always thought was a fantastic misnomer because it was so generous towards some technologies that it was going to bring some inflation in its wake. There was no question.
Clearly.
But when I look at, we've got like that Revolution Wind project or many, many projects, investments in factories, a lot of it was around delivery of electricity. And the US needs electricity. And it needs, the quickest thing to build is, frankly, an onshore wind farm or solar. And the quickest thing to add to get around a grid bottleneck is not building a pylon run that takes 7 years to get permits and whatever. It's actually a battery, right? And so by killing the momentum of those developments, you're actually going to restrict electricity growth in the US just at the time when some of the richest companies in the world, the hyperscalers, the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks and so on, suddenly they're in the market for huge amounts of electricity and they can outbid anyone, right? There is not a neighborhood that can outbid. It's going to be down to, the utility commissioners are going to they're going to be in daily fights to try to preserve electricity for communities and then be accused of stifling growth. And the electricity price is going to be shooting up. And then, of course, you've got the tariffs, because at the same time, you've got tariffs. Guess where these gas turbines, who makes the gas turbines that we're going to be using for data centers and other uses, or transformers? Not that many of them are made in the US. And ramping up the supply chain, if you think that you can do that in 2 years, you've got a 2032, 2034 waiting time for large transformers and turbines. So your tariffs on that are a huge mistake, frankly. Tariffs on copper. What do you think we use copper for? Electrification, electric supply. So we've just got, and then even frankly, on the gas side, it's all very well to go over and throw your weight around and do a deal with Europe that says they're going to have to buy $250 million worth of LNG every year, which, by the way, is more. I mean, I don't even know where it's supposed to come from. But what is that going to do to the price of natural gas, the Henry Hub? If you try and export that amount, if you permit every single liquefaction train and start exporting what is frankly 2, 3, 4 times the amount of LNG that the US has exported historically, it's going to drive the prices up domestically. It can't not. So energy inflation, if I'm right, maybe you'll have me back on the show in another 2 years. If I'm right, I think it changes the political narrative. I don't see how Main Street America can look at energy cost inflation, utility bills, small businesses going out of business because of energy costs, and still say, oh, this is a fabulous strategy. This is a plan. Of course, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the US economy is so vibrant and so flexible that it'll just be able to kind of shrug this off and produce more LNG and everything will be fine. I completely accept I may be wrong, but I'm very scared for energy prices in the US.
No, I think from what we're seeing in Texas, you're right on. We actually had on a previous episode, Drew Darby, state representative, who has been focused on that, talking about the amount of electricity that is required in power generation in West Texas. And the challenge there is that to fund that, you have to have the whole state approve. But why does Houston and these other urban areas want to spend that money when it really affects more of West Texas? And then West Texas is also where they're talking about putting a lot of AI and Bitcoin and all this power needing industry. And so it creates a very yours, mine conflict. Then you have the little issue of those things don't just sprout up overnight. So you've got a timing issue and an investment issue that really creates significant challenges from a planning. You throw in your point about the uncertainty and the business risks that could be created through pulling permits. That makes for an interesting business decision.
Right.
Mike,
And for these AI data centers, there's been this kind of assumption that they're going to be nuclear. And then people worked out that actually building small modular reactors that have not even been through the permitting process, it's probably not going to hit this side of 2032. 2035 is more likely. So there is some existing nuclear, mop it up, get those plants back running again, 3 Mile Island, etc. Absolutely. But that's a few gigawatts, right? That is not US scale provision of electricity. So then you say, oh, well, we'll just go to gas, 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 gas. Look at the gas. Well, gas. Yeah, but then you need the turbines, right? And then you need
The
all of the
midstream pipeline,
connectivity.
you got to get it
So
there.
what's
And
actually, yeah, and the pipeline side. So what's actually going to happen in the end? I believe that these hyperscalers are going to find out exactly what US utilities found, which is that the quickest and simplest thing to do is to build wind and solar and stick in a load of batteries and then kind of, cobble it together with new pylons, new grid if you can. But that's not going to be faster or slower than the gas turbines come through the supply chain. And then you start to say, well, okay, that's fine. But if you come up with that plan, what happens if somebody then says, oh, wait a minute, those solar panels are Chinese. You're going to have 100% tariff, 50% tariff, whatever. And suddenly the cost, it's all inflationary. It's all inflationary, right?
Michael, I could keep going on, but I know you have other things to do. But I so appreciate your time, your wisdom, your generosity of thought and time. Uh, I do a terrible job of making introductions. So please tell the audience what cleaning up is all about and where to find that.
So Cleaning Up is a podcast. You can also find it on YouTube. In fact, a lot of people are now watching it. More people watching it on YouTube than on than listening on the
Is that so
podcast.
they can see your
And
face on a regular basis, or
well, I have a co-host who's, who sort of, I would say is probably more popular than me. I don't know. I have to be careful what I say.
yes,
But
please.
Bryony Worthington has had people like Mohammed El Arian, and she's also had the head of operations of Joby Aviation. So she does a great job with a lot of the international speakers. I've had Dan Jorgensen, European Energy Commissioner. I've had Ben
You've had
Burden,
fantastic
recent
ones.
episode. He's the former CEO of Shell. And we have these, really conversations, I would say, like this. Some of them are quite challenging. And then there's one episode I want to ask if anybody is interested and they have a moment to watch. I went off to visit a project that I created in West Africa, in Sierra Leone. And it was pretty much exactly at the time that USAID was being shuttered. I went off to look at this project where I put solar and battery power into a neonatal intensive care unit. It's called Project Bow. So if you go to Cleaning Up and, you want to see, actually forget the politics and just look at what these technologies can do in terms of really not just changing lives, saving lives, then that's a great episode. So Cleaning Up on YouTube or a podcast.
Well, and I think in that case, it went from having 7 or 8 kids to now multiples of that, and the mortality rate has dropped significantly because of the efforts that of providing stable power that you did through
So
your solar, if I recall.
first of all, let me say all credit goes to the medical team, right?
Sure,
All that I and
but
my
it
little
takes a
team
village,
put
and
together.
if you don't have power, how do you keep those incubators going?
Exactly. I just gave them the tools they needed to do their job. But what was amazing was that that unit went from 60 babies a month and 25% mortality. The mortality dropped by half, which of course saves, tens of lives many tens per year. But the amazing thing is, once that unit had electricity and was kind of running smoothly and obviously doing a great job, they now have 140 babies per month. So those additional babies would not have been brought to the unit. They probably, many, many, many of them would have died.
Would have died.
So there are now hundreds of babies that team is able to save by the simple expedient of having reliable power, being able to provide oxygen and warmth and light during the nights.
So please look at Cleaning Up, and especially he has an episode only on pragmatic climate reset. His article that he did, in contrast to Daniel Jurgen, who's obviously a very bright individual. So what a great comparison back and forth. Michael, again, thank you for your time. Appreciate everyone listening to another episode of Oilfield Strong, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.